connects to the exhibition that we currently have at the museum called New York Modern. I hope that when you came in, you picked up a program for the evening and also a postcard for the current exhibition, New York Modern. For those of you who have not been to the Skyscraper Museum, it's in Lower Manhattan in Battery Park City at 39 Battery Place. We're open Wednesday through Sunday from noon to 6. And the exhibition, New York Modern, connects to the idea of Rockefeller Center because it explores the idea of the city of the future in the early 20th century. In fact, it's part of a spectrum, a three-part survey of shows called Future City 2021. The first exploration of the city of the future is New York in the early 20th century, from 1900 and 1920s and 30s, as the idea, sort of the living embodiment of the city of the future, predicting the direction of future centuries. And at the end of June, so you have an opportunity to still connect to New York Modern for about another 7 weeks or so. At the end of June, we'll open a second exhibition exploring the idea of the 21st century future city, and we look at a comparison between Hong Kong and New York. So an exhibition called Future Cities, for vertical cities, Hong Kong and New York, will explore those connections and the repetition of the same pattern of urbanization and modernization that we look at in the city. And the third exhibition will explore Shanghai as a predictor of 21st century urbanism. So the idea of the city of the future in Rockefeller Center. As it happens tonight, we're looking at both history, present, and towards the future in Rockefeller Center as we explore its presence and its continuing existence as a mega project within New York. The idea that Rockefeller Center really represents a kind of crystallization of the urban ideas of the 1920s is one of the things that we explore in the exhibition. So this 3-block site between avenues, this 11-acre project, this 15-building ensemble, which was the starter set of Rockefeller Center, and as we know, it expanded west, and it continues to hold a kind of heart of Midtown. In fact, it seems to center Midtown in terms of real estate values these days. Was one of the extraordinary examples of the ambitions of the 1920s. And it was the only example of a project at that scale. The scale of the Empire State Building is big, to be sure, the world's tallest building, but nothing in New York was 3 blocks long and a full avenue wide. So this mega project that predicts, in some sense, the future of the city, of urbanism in the 20th century, is also extremely exceptional in the New York context. It's also exceptional, it seems to me, in that it's so beloved by New Yorkers. It's come to be so. And that idea that the history, the complex and layered history of Rockefeller Center, which wasn't an easy start at first and wasn't accepted by critics in the first round of evaluations, has now grown into something which is, clearly a landmark, is what we want to explore tonight with a series of perspectives by scholars, by authors, by architects and planners. What is it that makes Rockefeller Center work, and does its master planning, its sort of tycoon developer's power, does that translate into the 21st century? So past, present, and future, like in the exhibition that we're exploring with different cities and different times, is our subject for this evening, as much as it is celebrating the 75th anniversary of Rockefeller Center. And in fact, the great RCA Building, Raymond Hood's creation, along with the associated architects of Rockefeller Center, Corbett and Harrison, and Reinhardt and Hoffmeister, are the geniuses that created this ensemble. Another genius, they're all geniuses on our panel tonight, but a particular genius book, it seems to me, is this one, and our first speaker tonight, Dan Okrent, Great Fortune, the epic of Rockefeller Center. If you haven't read this book, I strongly suggest it to you, and we just happen to have a few copies in the back. it up and get it autographed before you leave here tonight. Dan's book was really the inspiration for this evening because it was through his painstaking account of the description of the site assembly of the 3 blocks and the buying out of the leases that made me, who had studied this for many years, much better appreciate the phenomenal amount of difficulty and organization that was necessary in order to prepare the site. And as we think in New York about so many sites that seem to go forward and then they halt, whether it's Moynihan Station or Hudson Yards or Atlantic Yards, I think when we reflect back at a place that we find enormously successful today, that we might question our opinions, either historical or present, about the nature of mega projects. So we move forward through the history that Dan's going to present to an architect's appreciation of Rockefeller Center, and that's Bill Pedersen. Bill is, of course, one of the founding partners of KPF, Cohn, Pedersen, and Fox. And he's a longtime lover of Rockefeller Center, I know, because I remember at least like 10 years ago we talked about Rockefeller Center's urbanism. And so I always held that in my mind, and when I thought we would pay tribute to Rockefeller Center tonight, I knew that we had asked Bill Pedersen to talk about his urbanism. James Sanders, we're still waiting to arrive. But if and when he does, he'll talk about the sort of media capital that Rockefeller Center, or Radio City, created, and the idea of a city within a city. But we have also so much richness of experience in the history of New York here. Hilary Ballin, who's an architecture historian, for many years at Columbia and now at NYU, where she's helping to design a giant mega project. The NYU's Abu Dhabi campus has undertaken to study a whole range of New York projects, as well as urban projects in 17th century France, but in particular in New York, the history of Penn Station. And then a year ago, I'm sure many of you saw at least one of the 3 venues of the exhibitions on Robert Moses and Robert Moses in the Modern City that she organized. So she has much experience with thinking on a big scale. And then Alex Garvin, an architect and a planner, as well as an author, who has both written about the history of cities, has planned them, and has been involved in many projects in New York, but I think probably most of you are familiar with his name when he oversaw the master plan for the Ground Zero's redevelopment. So we have tried and true New Yorkers, historians, storytellers, and I need to very quickly then, more than I have so far gotten out of the way. I'm not going to be speaking about the program because, and I'm just going to show you from our website, the page from New York Modern, and then the screen from the lecture that I gave in a series at the museum. There's about 90 minutes worth of me talking about Rockefeller Center on the website and streaming video, so you can hear that and you can see many images. And if you're in the mood for more, there's about 6 or 7 other hours worth of me lecturing in a series of 5 lectures that are all listed up there. So on the City of the Future, Hugh Ferris, Corbett, and Hood. So you can get as much of me as you can possibly handle. But now I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and if you want to speak from there, you can speak from here. It doesn't matter.
Thank you very much, Carol. The good news is I'm going to reduce 512 pages to 15 minutes. So it won't be painstaking. Is that a compliment when you said it was painstaking? I just wanted to be sure. I think it's appropriate that we're here at the Donnell Library because this is really part of what was the larger plan for Rockefeller Center. If you were to draw a line from Rockefeller Plaza, the street that runs between the skating rink, what used to be a street, between the skating rink and the RCA Building, which I will never call the GE Building, it will always be the RCA Building. If you draw a line from there, it goes straight up to the door of the Rockefeller Museum, namely the Museum of Modern Art, which was, of course, founded by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And the notion that Wallace Harrison developed along the way was that there would be a communications city at Rockefeller Center, and that this would be another center that would be for arts and culture. what became City Center was supposed to be here. The CBS building originally was supposed to be here, and it was going to kind of close off this grand triumphal way. That didn't happen because the 21 Club was in the way, and the owners, Quindler and Burns at the 21 Club, had more political power than the Rockefellers. They were able to stop it. The other way that the Donnell Library comes into it, when this building was built, I think that's south, I believe, so that backs up to the 21 Club. You all know that 21 was a speakeasy during Prohibition, and once they were raided and they had to pull the lever that released all the bottles from the back bar down a chute and crashing into a basement. And when when the excavation began for the Donnell Library, it smelled like rye and gin. Carol asked me to set the historical context, which I hope that I can do with some speed. The context that matters most is what was there before. Midtown Manhattan in the 1920s became the Manhattan that we know today, in the sense that it became a city of skyscrapers, of business and of commerce, except for 3 square blocks in the middle, right in the middle, from 51st Street to 48th Street, from 5th Avenue to 6th Avenue. That was land that was owned for complicated historical reasons, page 27 through 29, by Columbia University. It was called the Upper Estate. They had owned it since 1815, and it had never been developed. It was just a bunch of brownstones, 228 brownstones, rent payers, that Columbia had neglected. They collected the money from the ground leases, and the city grew up around it. And if you look at pictures from those days, you see the French building, you see the Empire State Building beginning to go up, the Chrysler Building in the distance, many other buildings that became the profile of Midtown Manhattan. And here were 228 really sort of lousy, by that time, condition brownstones. It was speakeasies, it was whorehouses, it was rooming houses, it was fallow, and it wasn't producing real income for Columbia University. That's when the people at Columbia thought that they could make some money out of it by having somebody develop it. Developers, I'm going to talk about how it came to be a bit. There are really 3 co-authors in my mind of Rockefeller Center, one midwife, and at the end, a force of nature that I'll be addressing. I'm not going to talk about Nicholas Murray Butler, the president of Columbia, who set it in motion, and Teddy Roosevelt called an aggressive and violent ass. Nor will I talk about David Sarnoff, the man who ran the RCA Corporation, who became the most important tenant, described by a contemporary as a communist's idea of a capitalist, nor Martha Graham, Benito Mussolini, Ben Shahn, or Edgar Bergen, all of whom played roles in the development of rock. I will talk about Edgar Bergen, I can't stop that. First, the midwife. That was Otto Kahn. For those of you who don't know about Otto Kahn, he was the Maecenas of New York from the first 2 decades, first almost 3 decades of the 20th century. Everything cultural in New York, Otto Kahn, who was a Wall Street banker, had his hand in, to such a degree that he even owned the Metropolitan Opera. It was his private business. He actually owned 91% of the stock. He had some friends who were involved in it as well. He did not own the old building. Those of us who are old enough to remember the Yellow Brick Brewery, as some called it, on 38th Street and Broadway, where the Metropolitan had been working since the 1890s. And he felt that the place needed a much better opera house where people could actually see the stage for more than 55% of the seats. He began the effort to find to develop a new opera house. But the people who owned the old opera house, a group of New York aristocrats called the Metropolitan Opera Real Estate Company, they really couldn't play ball with Kahn. He offered them a big piece of land behind Joseph Urban's Hearst Corporation building at the corner of 8th Avenue and 57th Street, and west from there, where the Park Von Dome apartment building is now. But the people who ran the real estate company, Vanderbilt's among them, didn't want it. They said it was too far west. Some people thought that meant it was too far from all the property that the Vanderbilts owned on the east side that could be benefit from having the opera house built near there. There were people who thought that anti-Semitism was involved. Actually, Kahn had converted. Some people referred to him as the flyleaf between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But the reason they finally gave was that really the Metropolitan Opera Company could not have its house in the middle of a block. It had to be on a corner, and they were offended by that. Nicholas Murray Butler saw an opportunity here, and he brought in to the picture the first of the 3 co-authors of Rockefeller Center, John D. Rockefeller Jr. He's a figure sort of lost to most views of Rockefeller family history. We all know about John D. I, his father, who built the gigantic fortune, largest fortune in the world at his time. And we all know about the 5 brothers and the 1 sister in the generation of David and Nelson Rockefeller. John Jr., the son, once met Mark Twain, who called him a plain, simple, earnest, sincere, honest, well-meaning, commonplace person, destitute of any originality or any suggestion of it. On the other hand, he was about as public-spirited a figure as ever in New York. And the number of contributions that John D. Rockefeller Jr., who spent his entire career in philanthropy, never worked in business at all, that he made to New York, it's really countless. Everything from the New York Hospital to the Cloisters, to the Modern Art Museum, obviously, and then his one commercial effort, Rockefeller Center. He had no experience in development, he had no knowledge of architecture, and he didn't even like the opera very much, but he felt a civic responsibility. And in January 1929, he signed a lease that with its extensions would have lasted for 97 years for these 3 blocks of Midtown at a fixed rate of fundamentally of $3.3 billion. So he had some business sense because the Rockefellers were still paying to Columbia $3.3 billion as late as the 1970s before a renegotiation. What he wasn't able to do, because he wasn't a developer, was something with the land. And that brings in the second co-author, John R. Todd, grandfather of Christy Todd Whitman, former governor of New Jersey and director of the Environmental Protection Administration. John R. Todd was one of the great developers of his time. He did a lot of work on the Upper West Side, a lot of apartment buildings on Riverside and West End Avenue, and then he moved into commercial real estate, and his great success was the Graybar Building on Lexington Avenue. And the great success of it was that it was a money-making machine at a time that commercial real estate in New York was in an extraordinary boom because of the boom of the 20s. Todd was an entrepreneur. He was a bully. He had absolute disregard for architects, and said to one of the key architects on Rockefeller Center one day, he said, "For an architect, you show an almost human intelligence." He contributed several critical ideas in addition to fabulous managerial skills. First, he said, no opera house, and he did everything he could to persuade Jr., as John D. Rockefeller Jr. is known in family mythology, to persuade him that he didn't want an opera house there. The thinking was, if you have an opera house, in the daytime you have dead space. And he saw a commercial establishment in the middle of Manhattan, and he wanted it to be alive. He didn't want a big, hulking, empty building there. He was able to persuade Jr. to not go ahead with the opera house, largely because 9 months after signing the lease, the stock market crashed. The Depression was about to begin, and the grandees of the Metropolitan Opera Real Estate Company went to Jr. and said, "Why don't you build us the house as well, instead of just giving us the land?" At that point, he said, "No thanks, I'll decide to go it alone," and brought in Todd. He wanted mixed use, he wanted high value, and he wanted to control the project. That was essential to everything that John R. Todd did. That's when he brought in the Associated Architects, 8 different architects who are named. The names are up, some of the names are up there now. And the notion behind it, actually, the 8 architects, one that's left out who deserves to be included in there is Edward Durrell Stone, of all people, whom we don't generally connect with Rockefeller Center, but he did Radio City Music Hall, the interiors particularly, as his own project. He also spent a great deal of time back there at the 21 Club. They said of Edward Durrell Stone, Ed Stone could draw anything but a sober breath. John R. Todd, he said about the architects that he hired, "I like having a lot of people against me because the more there are, the more they get balled up and start talking at cross purposes, giving me ammunition to use effectively against them." And though there's a certain jocular tone to that, he was very, very serious about it. He became the person who would make all the major determinations of what would happen rather than the architect. He's effectively the planner. He's effectively the site architect. But among the 8 architects that he brought in, there was one who really is my third co-author, and I think the great genius of Rockefeller Center, and that's Raymond Hood. Raymond Hood was the antithesis of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was a teetotaling Baptist and a very, very shy man. Also the antithesis of Todd. He was a man who was loved by everybody he knew, including most of the bartenders in Manhattan at the time, and by most of his clients as well. One of them said of him that life with Ray is a joyride in which everyone gets the thrill. One example of that, whenever Ray Hood was driving his car, as he approached an intersection, he would speed up. And his passenger, Ray, what are you doing? It's dangerous there. He says, well, that's why we have to get through it quickly. Somebody else said that Ray Hood's patron saint was a whim. And I think that's, though he was a whimsical guy, he certainly wasn't as an architect. He had a theory. The theory was summed in 3 words: congestion is good. He believed in the urban context. He believed in people being next to each other, that there was great virtue in that. He had a practical sense. That was best displayed as far as Todd was concerned when he had the ideas for the roof gardens on the lower buildings and on the setbacks of Rockefeller Center, because with the roof gardens, that would give a better view for the tenants, and Todd figured that was $1 per square foot more. And then aesthetically, and as an engineer, as an architect, and my colleagues who know more about this than I will talk about it, among his really brilliant ideas, if you look at this great blade of a building, the RCA Building coming up, and you see the sides of it falling away, we've all noticed how it gets narrow as it gets to the top. That's where the elevators end, where each bank of elevators ends. And by moving the wall in from there, he was able to maintain no greater than 27.5 feet from any window for any office in the place, which made the offices that much more valuable. There's no interior space, really, that's lost to elevator shafts in Rockefeller Center, in the RCA Building. When the plans were presented, Louis Mumford, the leading architectural critic of the time, writing in the New Yorker, wrote about it constantly. Every time a new piece of plan came forward or a building opened, he would write about it. I'd like to quote a few of what things Mumford said. "I cannot find a word of even faint praise for Rockefeller Center. It is bad with an almost juvenile badness." This is 1933. The RCA setbacks of the building. He says, "The little scratchy tooth marks the mice have left in their cheese." Overall, Mumford said Rockefeller Center was mediocrity through a magnifying glass. 1933, the depths of the Depression, 64% when the building opens up. Construction begins in 1930-31. 64% of people who worked in the construction trades in New York were unemployed. The president of U.S. Steel said, "You can't even begin to realize how desperate we were for business." There was no construction anywhere. The Empire State Building had just been completed, and there was nothing else built privately of any size in New York until after World War II. It was only this project that kept the construction industry alive. They kept a lot of architects and draftsmen alive, and people who supplied the limestone and the glass and the doors and the doorknobs. Really hundreds of thousands of people around the country and in some cases around the world because of this project, because John D. Rockefeller Jr. could afford to do it. One of the other things he could afford to do was overbuild, which Todd gets credit for seeing that this was done, so that they were able to save so much on the materials and to some degree on labor that they were able to do things that would have been uneconomical had things been at fair market price. For instance, making it possible to install air conditioning when air conditioning came along. One of the things that has kept it in great shape. Office space in New York had doubled between 1925 and 1929. With the addition of Rockefeller Center and the Empire State Building, it increased another 50% by 1933, and everything was empty. The Empire State Building, in fact, was called the Empty State Building. In Hood's own McGraw-Hill Building on 42nd Street, there were floors where kids would come in and roller skate during the day. But the Rockefellers were able to make this work, partly because of the depths of their pocket, and partly because of the force of nature that I mentioned. And that's a fellow named Nelson Rockefeller, all of whom we're familiar with. Nelson Rockefeller, at 21, returns from Dartmouth College, goes on a 9-month honeymoon around the world where he met Mohandas Gandhi, and said in his journal he was surprised that Gandhi wasn't very interested in him. Came back to New York, walked into his father's office, walked up figuratively to his brother John D. Rockefeller III, who was a shy and timid man, batted him to the side and took over. He took over the renting program. He made certain that Rockefeller businesses like Standard Oil, obviously, and many others, the Rockefeller Foundation, that they came in and occupied the empty space. He brought in other people from all over the city by cutting prices, by underpricing everybody else in town. and did whatever he could to make the thing succeed. And he really drove it home. Among the other things that he did was he saw to the ouster of John R. Todd, because he knew that he could never really be in charge until Todd was out of the way. So finally we get to 1939, and in what is now the Simon & Schuster building, the last of the original suite of buildings, and they drive the last rivet. This amazing project is done. The Depression is over by now. Within 5 years, every inch of office space in the Rockefeller Center is occupied. The war boom fills it up. But there's this wonderful completed project, and Lewis Mumford steps forward again in the pages of the New Yorker, and he writes, "It has turned out so well, it could be considered a serene eyeful. It is the most exciting mass of buildings in the city." And he never bothered to explain why he had said anything different, or even that he had said anything different. I'll conclude with just a thought about Rockefeller Center today, and 2 reasons why I think that it remains such a great success. My esteemed colleagues will, I'm sure, have much more interesting and valid things to say about it. The first is that it was developed privately. I think that's absolutely essential to the story of it. That John R. Todd, with this enormous amount of money, could do what he wished to do, and didn't have to worry about satisfying a lot of people who had a lot of other interests in it. He saw a first-class development, he was determined to build it, he had the resources to build it, and was able to. What's interesting, and the second thing about it, is that it's part of the grid of the city. We walk through Rockefeller Center. You go from east to west, north to south, you would never leave the city. In fact, because it's privately owned, privately developed, privately owned and very well cared for today by Tishman Speyer, when you walk through it, notice, look down, the streets, there's no paper on the streets. The private cleaning crew cleans it up. There are no trucks waiting outside to unload because there's a huge loading platform underground that you enter from 50th Street near the Associated Press building. It maintains the sort of things that, it maintains a quality that must be maintained if you're going to rent space at high prices. The discouraging thing to me is that the Rockefeller family, really responsible for this, didn't learn a lot from it. Lincoln Center was developed, the head of Lincoln Center was John D. Rockefeller III, Nelson's brother. And there we see right now, partly it's being redone because it needs to be so badly. It's not part of the city. If you walk along Amsterdam Avenue, there's a Berlin Wall backing it that closed off the projects from it. It's set aside. And then there's the World Trade Center, where both David Rockefeller is involved in the Lower Manhattan Commission, and Nelson Rockefeller, as governor, were key figures in that. And that, too, separate from the city, publicly financed, dependent on public largesse, and a lot of people getting their hands into it. It's a tragedy, I think, that we have this great, great gem right here in our city, and that we haven't learned a lot from it. I said I'd mention Edgar Bergen and his role in it. The important thing that Edgar Bergen did was he made his first radio broadcasts from the Rainbow Room in 1937 and 1938, and became the highest paid entertainer in the country as a result. And I would like someone afterward, it's okay, if you could explain to me how you become a huge success on the radio if you're a ventriloquist. Thank you.
That was terrific, Dan. Mr. Todd's assessment of the intellectual capabilities of the architectural profession, I guess, relieves me of the responsibility of adhering to the facts in this case. I present to you what Rockefeller Center means to me. Given this distinguished panel and my usual role of presenting one slide after another, I thought I would read you the scholarly paper. So this I do at great risk. Several years ago, I was asked to write an essay on the architect who has most profoundly affected my work. As a student, Louis Kahn dominated my thoughts. After graduate school, I was privileged to work closely with I.M. Pei on the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. The work of Alvar Aalto and Jorn Utzon has resonated with me for reasons greater than my Nordic heritage. However, it is my belief that buildings, not the individuals behind them, should be an architect's fundamental source of inspiration. Consequently, I selected not just a building, but rather a group of buildings as my seminal influence. My career has been devoted, in part, to finding strategies for the urban high-rise office building. No building or group of buildings has been more influential to me in that search than Rockefeller Center. Conceived and designed during a period of great prosperity and executed during a period of economic despair, Rockefeller Center reveals both in its architecture and in its process of design numerous paradoxes whose resolution brought about the greatest urban architectural assemblage of the 20th century. The Rockefeller Center that we revere today is a result of what must have been a titanic effort. An effort that, for me, is symbolized by the statue of Atlas facing visitors as they enter off Fifth Avenue. The reality and the myth of Rockefeller Center have had a profound impact on my architectural sensibility. I identify it, architecture, not an architect, buildings and not a building, as my most significant architectural influence. My architectural practice brings me into frequent confrontation with this question. Does designing large-scale urban buildings for those who use them as financial instruments of profit diminish artistic resolve and promote an inevitable compromise of ideals? Rockefeller Center has proved itself a beacon, showing that there is a way out of this contemporary labyrinth. The status of Rockefeller Center as a masterpiece is undeniable. Its architecture, evaluated solely through artistic merit, compared me to study it closely. So engaged, one quickly understands that the process of design was as unusual and exceptional as the architecture it created. All those involved in this process were in pursuit of excellence. Each defined excellence in somewhat different terms. Each respected, I thought, the other's definition. Above all, they realized the juxtaposition of Rockefeller Center as a financial enterprise and Rockefeller Center as a work of art to be the guiding dynamic of their search. The architectural critic and historian Colin Rowe said that traditional architecture is largely focused on the internal angle, which creates forms embracing space. In contrast, modern architecture, he said, is the product of the external angle that creates form as an isolated object. One only has to look at the contemporary city to understand the condition Mr. Rowe so neatly summarized. Rockefeller Center, however, bonds the reading of buildings as figural objects and space as figural void into a fluctuating state of coexistence, thereby reconciling the conflict between the traditional and the modern condition. Most remarkable, the example set by Rockefeller Center was subsequently ignored. Soon after its construction, modern architecture took center stage, and its influence brought about the contemporary city, a city of unrelated structures, standing alone with little regard for each other, and with even less regard for effectively shaping space into a larger public realm. The propensity for the modern city for isolated architectural events is further exacerbated by the fact that most contemporary urban structures are high-rise buildings. Once during a more romantic period in our history, these buildings were called skyscrapers, a term that engendered visions of the poetic possibilities inherent in their type. Now few take claim to such ambitions. At best, we can only refer to them as tall buildings. What is our modern city, if not predominantly an assemblage of large-scale structures of commercial sponsorship? The character of our major cities is defined by their ubiquitous distribution. These buildings, as instruments of profit, exploit the economic possibilities of excessive density. Rarely, however, do they give back to a place anything that they take. Why then, given the effect that they have in our physical realm, are the urbanistic issues tall buildings raise given so little attention? To me, concern for the role of the tall building within the city is fundamental to the concern for urbanism as an architectural issue. One does not exist without the other. At the beginning of the last century, the picture was remarkably different. although Cass Gilbert underscored the exploitive qualities of tall buildings when he said, "The skyscraper is an invention that makes the land pay." He went on to design the Great Woolworth Building, one of the most romantic skyscrapers of the era. Then architects enthusiastically accepted the challenge of high-rise buildings. New York in the 1920s was an era that brought together theatricality and power. New Yorkers are proud of the city's financial strength and encourage the cultural and artistic opportunities it both afforded and attracted. Architects trained in the system of the Beaux-Arts and intoxicated by the spirit of Art Deco rose to the challenge. They conceived many of our most exuberant tall buildings to represent the success of the corporations or institutions that sponsored them. It was a remarkably coherent and focused outpouring of architectural creativity aimed at defining the character and spirit of New York during a great period of civic optimism. During those heady days, theoretical visions for the development of New York also occupied the minds of its architects. Hugh Ferris, the great architectural illustrator, and architects Raymond Hood and Henry Corbett took as a point of departure the hard-headed reality of New York's existing urban condition. Ferris translated the demanding setback profile of the 1916 New York zoning code into a poetic vision of tall buildings almost geological in their power and form. Hood, too, explored the metaphor of the skyscraper as urban mountain in his Manhattan 1950 plan. In it, a confluence of skyscrapers celebrated the critical junctures in Manhattan's neutral grid. Corbett envisioned New York on a Venetian model, vertically separating vehicular and pedestrian movement. Theirs was a type of urbanistic alchemy. For Hood and Corbett, theory turned into practice when they were invited to join the design team for Rockefeller Center. However, for me, the spirit and power of Ferris's drawings was perhaps the most influential as a visual stimulus for the design of Rockefeller Center. Now, 75 years after it was built, Rockefeller Center remains the dominant illustration of the urban possibilities inherent in high-rise buildings. Ideas fundamental to this brilliant work breathe with as much vitality today as when they were initially conceived. The team that created Rockefeller Center included a divergent cast of characters. At one pole was the client, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who wanted to leave New York a great architectural legacy, one that would also illustrate the principles of his own personal philosophy. At the other pole stood Raymond Hood, a man fully aware of the enormity of the architectural responsibility and romantically inspired by the poetic possibilities of the city of towers. Between were positioned the balancing sensibilities of contractors, real estate developers, and a number of independent architects. The design process they collectively created, while necessarily collaborative and inevitably competitive, was primarily comparative. Every possibility, every concept was drawn, modeled, critiqued, and analyzed by the entire ensemble. Early individual contributions by both Hood and Corbett were discarded, as were hundreds more, until gradually a final shape and form emerged from the pressures of program and context. Theirs was not a process that tolerated artistic grandstanding. It was one that allowed only the best concepts to be realized regardless of their source. The only hierarchy they realized was one of ideas. The humility of their collective dynamic is illustrated most nobly by one of John D. Rockefeller's credos cast on the tablet in Rockefeller Center. Quote, "I believe that only in the purifying fire of sacrifice is the dross of selfishness consumed and the greatness of the human soul set free." Unquote. All this having been said, Rockefeller Center did not come about without a powerful source of artistic inspiration. My eyes identified one source of this inspiration, the metaphor of a skyscraper as an urban mountain. Seen across Central Park on a misty night, little distance separates its built form from the evocations of a visionary Ferris rendering. With the guiding spirit of this dominant metaphor, designers of Rockefeller Center were able to breathe energy into its potentially ponderous volumes. Mountains smoothly connect through a series of escalating heights, the horizontal condition to the vertical. Similarly, Rockefeller Center follows nature's compositional example and fulfills the skyscraper's responsibility of meaningfully joining earth and sky. The vertical boundaries of Rockefeller Center are so energetically composed that they vigorously compel the eye to move from height to greater height. The French and English buildings can almost be thought of as the foothills initiating this climb to the center's peak, the often cloud-enshrouded Rainbow Room. The rock-cut quality of the center's volumes vividly fulfills the geological connection. Slab-like strata peel away as the buildings ascend, revealing rooftop gardens on their horizontal ledges. These gardens are an urban inversion of Machu Picchu, perched high in the Andes. Machu Picchu is a work of man and a work of nature. Rockefeller Center's gardens are nature surrounded by man-made mountains. While the vertical boundaries of Rockefeller Center engage the sky, the lateral boundaries create a bond with the surrounding context. Rather than stridently marking the entrance to a precinct, the boundaries of the center engage their neighbors in an embracing dialogue. If the protagonist in Rockefeller Center's vertical procession is a figural solid of its tallest structure, the RCA Building, the stabilizing component of its lateral dynamic is the carefully scaled void of the center's skating rink. Axially connected between Fifth Avenue and the RCA Tower, the extraordinary intimacy of the spatial sequence to the center's center is created by the skillful manipulation of volume that never allows mass to overwhelm space. Most brilliantly, one is drawn by gravity toward this focus. Here, Rockefeller Center creates equilibrium between buildings and space, a space unachieved before or since in the modern city. Rockefeller Center was designed at a time when functionalist theories emanating from the Bauhaus encouraged buildings of a similar type to speak a similar language, regardless of place. Few structures are as susceptible to the imposition of an intended international vocabulary as is a tall office building. Its form and function offer little resistance to reductive abstraction or, for that matter, to any form of styling. However, the international style had little influence on the designers of Rockefeller Center. Their intention was to absorb inspiration from the style and character of Manhattan, balancing the heroic visions of Hugh Ferris's urban geology with the mature evolution of Art Deco as an architectural style. They deftly wove machined edges into weighty surfaces vertically striated in cleft limestone. The resulting dynamic between nature and the machine reinforces the dialectical strength of the architecture, creating a perfect balance of 1920s verve and 1930s sobriety. Together they seem to represent reality and optimism engaged in the pursuit of an ideal. No work of architecture has more successfully forged a connection to place and to time. Is Rockefeller Center a masterpiece without a genius? Unless one had direct exposure to the process of its design, it is impossible to judge. Certainly the previous work of the team's most prominent architect, Raymond Hood, was skillful and inspired. However, none of it rises to the aesthetic level of Rockefeller Center. Together, the team accomplished something none had achieved alone. The process was almost that of the scientific method. Theirs was a process at once collaborative, comparative, and competitive. The making of large-scale urban architecture with its complex requirements demands such a method. However, as with any form of human activity, it requires the right participants. It has always been my aspiration to participate with highly talented and motivated architects in a design process that enables the best architectural ideas to be realized. No better model exists than for this working method than Rockefeller Center. Thank you.
I'm going to speak from some work I'm working on now in thinking about putting together a new book called Model Cities, which really came out of the very kind of frustrating experience that I had as a witness to the struggle to find new forms and new shapes and a new beginning at ground zero. It seemed striking to me that it seemed almost as if we had forgotten that it was New York that had invented the idea of the city within the city in modern terms. There have been versions of it in the earlier places, but this idea of a coordinated, multi-building, multi-use project with a civic and or commercial cast set within the existing city over several blocks was really something that one could say began, a tradition that began with Grand Central Terminal and then was brought to a sort of an apotheosis of sorts with Rockefeller Center. There's so many aspects, and then of course was carried forward, as our other speakers have noted, in projects like the World Trade Center. There are so many aspects to this, but given how short our time is today, I thought I would just look at one aspect of the way New York has dealt with this idea of the city within the city and at Rockefeller Center, and that's to think about the project, ironically, sort of in, I think, complementary terms to Bill's wonderful evocation of its towers, look rather at its street level or its lower levels. And in doing so, I'm going to take a cue from Gertrude Stein, who after visiting New York in 1937, coming back a little while from Paris, observed that, she said, "It was the Rockefeller Center buildings that pleased me most. Alice Toklas said, it is not the way they go into the air, but the way they come out of the ground that is the thing. European buildings sit on the ground, but American ones come out of the ground." Of course, when we talk about this idea of the street level, I'm really talking about the lower levels because just as Grand Central, one of the things that marked this sort of extraordinary explosion of creativity at Rockefeller Center was the decision not to place buildings on a surface grid, like as if the city were flat and we were just putting buildings down, but to completely reconceive the city in three-dimensional terms, as a kind of a three-dimensional composition that would have not only connections at street level, but below grade and above grade. The bridges between the buildings, of course, were never actually built, but certainly the rooftop gardens were, and this whole idea that the city was sort of something that could be manipulated plastically in three dimensions was sort of an extraordinary idea. Here are the gardens as they emerged. But I would say that Rockefeller Center even went beyond Grand Central Terminal in remaking the city, its sheer level of invention and excitement about the possibilities of urban life in the 20th century. And what is really striking to me is this, I think, evoked by the model, the kind of, the basic partie was so radical. It was neither, I mean, many wonderful skyscrapers and other kinds of buildings had been built in New York, lot by lot. Even the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, these great buildings, were still single buildings put on single pieces of property, filling part of a single lot. And it wasn't that. It was something much more ambitious and much broader than that. But of course, it wasn't either the modernist idea of the superblock that sort of wiped the whole city clean and put up this kind of new vision in front of it. I don't know what you'd call it, a multi-block or something. It not only preserved the existing streets, but in fact added to them. It added this cross street that was a holdover from the original 1928 plan by Benjamin Wistar Morris. It was, I think, the single most important stroke of the scheme. This is an early rendering. These renderings, by the way, are not by Ferris, but by John Wenrick. It took 3 long and ungainly blocks and transformed them into 6 shapely blocks with better proportion between their length and their width. Its interior street changed the entire scale of the project incredibly dramatically, brought a kind of smaller scale, made those small blocks really small, and gave you all sorts of options. 30 years before Jane Jacobs was calling our attention in The Death and Life of Great American Cities to the importance of small blocks to give the pedestrian many, many options and make places come alive, they were doing this in Rockefeller Center. But interestingly, having created this sort of, well, let me suggest that then urbanistically, the unit of Rockefeller Center remained, as in all the rest of New York, the block and the street and the sidewalk, just like the rest of New York. But what then went on was that they used architecture to knit together and unify this 6-block development into a single desirable urban community. The mass and the size of the buildings were placed for advantage, varying in their height and their footprint and their purpose and their orientation, allowing for better sunlight, better space, better scale, and a kind of a dynamism to the overall scheme. And yet, at the same time, their coordinated architectural language, in fact, is beautifully described by Bill, the sort of the cleft limestone and the beautiful kind of common language of the buildings, provided a coordinated experience. One knew one was moving into a special zone, a special place, that nonetheless was absolutely woven into the fabric of New York. It was just the kind of key idea that you, I'll go back to this plan because I think this one still shows it. The idea that, as Danny pointed out, as much as one was enriching the grid, one could still pass through it, as if it were just another part of the city. When it asked for no special behavior and no special dispensation, you didn't have to be doing anything different than you would do any other part of New York, and yet it would give you all this kind of enhanced idea of what a city could be. Now, what's all the more remarkable in light of this fact that it sort of had this unified architectural appearance was that it then, at the same time, responded very subtly and interestingly to what was around it, which is something Bill, I think, suggested and would like to pursue it a little bit more. The side that faced Fifth Avenue. Well, Fifth Avenue then, as to some degree now, but even more so then, remained a low-rise street. It had many old mansions were still there, and in some cases they had been converted into high-end shops. In other cases, new commercial buildings had been built, but they were generally low-rise. It had the sort of genteel style and tradition that it had always had as the kind of the great residential avenue of New York. And although it was changing, that was still what its mood and character was. And the center beautifully responded to that by having its 4 pavilion-like structures, 2 of which were actually wings of a larger structure, the International Building, but gave the illusion of rather low-rise, almost domestically scaled buildings along Fifth Avenue. In particular, the forecourt, the indentation at the International Building, with of course its great Atlas structure, then became something within that, became a subtler gesture to St. Patrick's Cathedral across the way. It became effectively a forecourt to the cathedral, as if saying, well, it's New York, the cathedral has to front the street, it can't have the piazza that traditional European buildings would have, so we're going to make one for you on the other side of the street, even though we're coming years later. We're going to retroactively give you the forecourt that you wanted. And of course, be a sort of a secular response to the spiritual presence of the cathedral. And then meanwhile, as you moved over to the 6th Avenue side of the project, and of course the Radio City end, you might call it, the project inflected itself, again within the same general language, inflected itself to the fact that it was moving toward Times Square. And this was the sort of the entertainment part of it. So both in its use and its language, its architecture, it was sort of bending itself toward that. This is where the NBC studio entrances were, this is where the Center Theater was, this was where Radio City Music Hall, of course, above all was. And in response to the relatively raucous atmosphere of 6th Avenue, which of course in those days not only did not have the big towers on the other side of the avenue, but it had the elevated railroad running right through it. This is where you found your neon signs and the marquees and a kind of a jazzier idea of what this building and this project could be. So it's as if saying, well, we're going to be this thing, but like a good neighbor and a good, be sort of social, we'll kind of try to deal with whoever we're responding to on either side. And then throughout the project, it seemed as if every aspect of urban life in New York was sort of being reimagined, reconceived, improved, and enhanced. The interior passageways that were created, particularly the Channel Gardens that was created between the British and French buildings toward leaning down, was a kind of a better sidewalk, a better urban environment, very similar to the sidewalks that all New Yorkers knew, but improved in every way with its scale and its fact it was strictly pedestrian, its planting, the fact that it was very gently sloped is one of the subtlest and most sort of theatrical elements of the project. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but as you step off Fifth Avenue, the designers are actually bringing you down, and it's why it's one of the things that, without you noticing it, is pushing you toward the plaza, is that you're actually on a slight slope, a little bit of a ramp going down. And the revolving flower displays and all of that, drawing your eye down to the plaza. It's hard to imagine then, this is kind of a lovely little detail of one of the gardens, and of course hard to imagine now how big and new and exciting an idea of the plaza itself was. I mean, it's something we just completely take for granted. But no office building had ever offered anything like it. Not the greatest office buildings and skyscrapers in New York had provided this idea of an open space attraction in the middle of the project. It would be a plaza during the summer. It would be a skating rink in the winter. And again, this is, it seems to me that what's happening here is these aren't just features, they're almost seasonal rituals in which the project is embedding itself not just in the spatial organization of the city, but in the life of the city across the year, so that it becomes part of the ritual that one goes there in the summer for this and in the winter for that. And of course, nothing could have symbolized that better than the giant Christmas tree that began to emerge rather early on and became, of course, probably, I think it's the biggest, it's certainly the most famous Christmas tree in the world. And one thing that's striking to me about that, and I won't go into a lot of that, but a lot of these things evolved organically after the Christmas tree began actually with the workers. Putting that, we have a wonderful picture in our New York book of the little first Christmas of the center, and this little scraggly little tree that the workers put up. And it went from there and evolved organically. And I think one of the things that was powerful about the project was the way it did evolve these rituals in a kind of organic way. One of the things that was always striking to me about the World Trade Center was how it never succeeded in creating sort of organic rituals. They kept trying to do things and trying, but everything was sort of forced and unconvincing compared to the rather powerful and convincing rituals and elements that were developed. Important to remember too about the plaza is that in fact it's not really a plaza. The actual space, the pedestrian space of it, is on the perimeter and takes the form of what? A linear space, like a sidewalk. It doesn't, again, it doesn't ask New Yorkers to act in a way they sort of wouldn't know how to act. The central space is in fact not a place you walk across, but the space for these extraordinary attractions, be it the plaza or the summer plaza or the winter. So, to conclude, I would say that, like Grand Central, Rockefeller Center represented a kind of a visionary rethinking about the possibilities of the city, but crucially growing organically from the city's urban existing patterns. There's a sense of daring imagination that's nonetheless disciplined by the existing workings of the city. And it uses its large layout, this large layout of the multi-block city within the city layout, to at once clarify New York and sort of explore the basic urban character of New York, even while it lifts it into something higher and greater. Thank you.
David Rockefeller batted John D. Rockefeller Jr. aside, Dan Okren tells us, and the Rockefellers learned nothing from Rockefeller Center. And it's not true. What I would like to argue is that Lincoln Center is a clear response to Rockefeller Center. And though you may think of one as a model of excellent urbanism and the other an example of deficient urbanism, in fact, in many ways, they're twins. John D. Rockefeller III was not the only one who learned from Rockefeller Center. So too did Robert Moses. And they were the two forces that brought Lincoln Center into being. So let me tell you what they learned from Rockefeller Center and how it played out at Lincoln Center. And first, Robert Moses. As Rockefeller Center approached completion, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia turned to Robert Moses, his park commissioner and big thinker about city planning, if not that in title, and asked him to evaluate a project to create a cultural arts campus just north of Rockefeller Center. The fact that the Metropolitan Opera had been unable to build a new house at Rockefeller Center was much on the minds of Mayor LaGuardia, and though his taste went to more popular forms of opera, he still saw it as a failure that a new opera house had not been built. And that was one of the key components of this cultural center that Moses was asked to evaluate. Two theaters joined together and connected on axis with a new mid-block street that was to be cut to connect this cultural compound with Rockefeller Center. And Moses wrote saying, this was a foolhardy idea. It was a foolhardy idea to bring together two great cultural buildings because there was no point in concentrating these theaters in one site. A surprising argument, you must think, for Moses to make. And the other point he thought was that the audience for operas was diminishing. Why create an opera house at all? But by the time we get to 1950, Moses learned enough about New York City real estate to see how difficult it was for a not-for-profit entity like an opera house to build itself anew in New York. The fact that even with a patron like the Rockefellers and a center like Rockefeller Center, that they could not create an opera house and needed to defer to commercial pressures there, he came to understand that it was necessary for government to intervene in order to realize cultural projects, in order to create an opportunity for not-for-profit entities to thrive in New York City and make a way in this crazy real estate market. And his intervention, Moses's intervention in the making of Lincoln Center, which was not an original idea of his, it was the realization of an idea that was just below the surface, pent-up frustrations, that the Opera House, that Philharmonic Hall, that other cultural projects could not get off the ground because of land costs. It was Moses who realized that the Urban Renewal Program created an opportunity to do just that. So the failure to build a new Metropolitan Opera House at Rockefeller Center was an important stimulus in the creation of Lincoln Center to create a platform for not just that opera house, but to create synergies by joining it with Philharmonics, the Symphony Orchestra, and ultimately, as you know, the other cultural entities, including a library for the performing arts on that site. Moses, of course, believed in the necessity of a powerful leader to integrate complex projects. And the most successful urban renewal projects that he was able to push along were those where he had a partner of that sort. Lincoln Center would not have come into being were it not for John D. Rockefeller, who may have been swatted away by David at Rockefeller Center, but who saw the powerful impact that a visionary leader could have. Lincoln Center is the realization of his gentle but nevertheless forceful guidance of that project. For without his intervention, you would not have had a complex of buildings that had a high architectural ambition. One of the things he learned from that family example at Midtown was that having a collaborative team of architects, as you heard Bill describe, having a collaborative team of outstanding architects was a crucial element in creating a significant urban space. So unlike the other projects where Moses had a strong hand and which were not mostly impressive as works of urban design, Lincoln Center did involve, thanks to John D. Rockefeller III, a group of architects with Wallace Harrison in charge, overseeing this unruly crew and driving to completion a set of buildings of distinction. Rockefeller Center went against the urban grain in some respects. You've, of course, heard and experienced the way it's connected at street level, and James in particular just evoked for you the ways in which its subdivision of large New York City blocks into 6 smaller ones helped to create a yet more dynamic urban fabric. But it went against the grain of New York, nevertheless, in grouping these blocks together, creating, if not a mega site, a mega block, a mega project, and in the idea of creating an architectural composition in the way that James so eloquently evoked. So instead of these set of buildings that really didn't respond or talk to one another, they did just that. And part, of course, of this project was carving out a public space, what eventually became the ice skating rink and the small plazas. And that was another important lesson that was learned from Rockefeller Center that was carried forward into Lincoln Center, that in the grid of New York, there were no built-in opportunities to carve out public space. And And in the prevailing language of urban design in the 1950s, the way to do that was within the context of the mega block. So yes, streets were annihilated. 62nd and 63rd Streets were closed in to create that platform, that is Lincoln Center. And yes, it turned inward and created the Berlin Wall that Dan referred to. But what it also did was to carve out a set of public spaces that secured a ground for congregating in ways that the street alone did not permit. So you may not think it as dynamic or as compelling as the spaces in Rockefeller Center, but it was that idea that was translated in Lincoln Center in the creation of the main plaza and the North Plaza in particular, and ultimately in the vision, though poorly executed, of the platform that spanned 65th Street to connect the main plaza and the Juilliard School to the north. Those are the anti-urban flaws, you might say, that are now being remedied in the renovations and the revisions underway at Lincoln Center. But the impulse to carve out a kind of urban space, a plaza, a piazza that belonged to all kinds of people, that was an impulse that Lincoln Center attempted to achieve. So the lessons of Rockefeller Center were translated in Lincoln Center. Look not at the change of urban form from skyscraper to low-rise structure, but think about the idea of congregating buildings and rescuing public space for uses, non-commercial uses, and think also about the difference between the commercial aspect of Rockefeller Center and the challenge of creating these cultural institutions, which was achieved at Lincoln Center. The mega project was something that simply was not achievable without a controlling force with economic power and the integrative authority that was demonstrated at Rockefeller Center. But in the aftermath of that project, what kinds of opportunities in New York existed for that to occur? The earlier examples of projects of this sort were done by major corporations. You've heard about Grand Central, although that's a building site that was established even before the city was built in around it. The real precedent for this kind of clearance project with the accretion or a major land assemblage operation to create a mega site, a multi-block site, was Pennsylvania Station. There you had a major corporation bring to completion in 1910 a project that not only erupted above ground level in that major building, Pennsylvania Station, but a subterranean network of transportation infrastructure funded not at all by the government, which seeded only the street bed, one street bed, two blocks long, 32nd Street. That was a privately financed venture. So too, Rockefeller Center. But what in the post-war period? Who was there to undertake such large-scale projects? And this is where the federal government, through the Urban Renewal Program, and the private developers who stepped in, were able to collaborate in remaking the urban fabric. The consequences were not always happy, but they do pose this dilemma of how could large-scale projects happen to change the character of a neighborhood. The district of tenements that Carol evoked in her opening remarks of brownstones that were replaced by the towers of Rockefeller Center, that renewal, clearance and then renewal project was the precedent for the renewal projects of the 1950s and the 1960s. And Lincoln Center is, you should see, the direct descendant of Rockefeller Center. And it poses, I think, a challenge to us now as you think about the mega projects still on the table, the subject that Alex Garvin, I believe, will turn to, because these are now developer-driven projects, and we have to ask once again, how is the public interest, how is the public realm advanced in these projects? You may quarrel with certain urban design features of Lincoln Center, but it stands for that challenging dilemma that we face in New York City. How public institutions make their way and blossom in the city, where real estate is so expensive. Thank you.
Let me start by saying I fell in love with Rockefeller Center when I was a small boy and was skating there. And I went week in, week out to Radio City to see the show and the movie, and to my favorite place of all, which was on top, where the view was much better than it was at the Empire State Building. That said, I don't think Rockefeller Center is exceptional. 1972, when I was at the City Planning Department, I made this map of available large-scale development sites in New York City. We have lots of them. Many of them, you will notice, have actually turned out to be built. Nor is Rockefeller Center, as several of the panelists said, something new. In fact, Grand Central Terminal is far larger, involves far more public realm, on many more blocks, and on many more levels. Not only did it involve covering up a huge territory, but look at the number of blocks and the pedestrian and vehicular and mass transit systems that intersect there, all of which set the stage for the rebuilding of a huge large-scale development. And we've been building large-scale developments ever since. More recently, there's the World Trade Center. But the World Trade Center did something very significantly different. It doesn't connect with the city without a bridge. There is 16.5 acres of land that was set aside from the rest of the city. So much so that in the wintertime, the plaza, which was 5.5 acres, had to be cordoned off because the icicles fell from it and people might get hurt. As you know, West Street is a barrier between what was then the World Trade Center and everything else. Well, in opposition to that, a whole series of large-scale developments began to be done, and I thought I'd show you a couple of them because they tried to reestablish the public realm that Rockefeller Center had so elegantly created in the first place. This is the way you usually see Battery Park City. A plan or a distant view. When you go up close, you will see the promenade, the streets, the sidewalks, and in fact, there's a map which you can find, and what does the map show? Not the buildings, but the public realm. And it isn't alone in that. The more recent Riverside South, which is not as elegant, nor as beautiful, nor does it have as ambitious a public realm, nevertheless, has a public realm, public parks, sidewalks, and that brings me to the project that I had something to do with for about 15 months and haven't been involved with for 5 years, and that's the second version of the World Trade Center. If you look at what had been there to begin with, there were streets and sidewalks. When the World Trade Center went in before it was destroyed, they were eliminated. And other than what has been taken for the memorial, the plan that was ultimately done by Danielle Libeskind puts back the streets. And prior even to the competition, which Studio Libeskind won, we managed to get Greenwich Street to go through and 7 World Trade Center to be part of a street system. Unfortunately, everything other than the privately owned parcels, which are being built by Larry Silverstein pursuant to the plan, there are no streets and there are no sidewalks, and the public realm, we'll see what happens when it finally emerges. The large-scale development projects that we are doing now have gone back to the world of the World Trade Center. They do not have the kind of public realm that Rockefeller Center did. If you go to the Hudson Yards, there are no streets. It's a huge super block with grandiose public spaces, which are more decorative in terms of their relationship to the tall buildings. And perhaps the worst of them is the Atlantic Yards. 3 big super blocks, no public realm whatsoever, no room for pedestrians. It should surprise you not at all that people object to it. I didn't see such signs at the Channel Gardens when I was there the last time. Thank you very much.
I was going to say, I think we perfectly agree that you know, it's so odd that with this extraordinary example staring us in the face and being acknowledged now for 75 years, that no one just doesn't seem to be able to do it. I mean, there are practical on-the-ground reasons having to do with, let's say, you know, building over the yard, the Red Central doesn't do that, you know, the expense. I mean, I was a little involved in the Hudson Yard project, and, you know, you saw this kind of terrible problem that was going on, which was that the cost of putting in the columns that you would need was so great that you couldn't support a low-rise building. It just wouldn't pay. So everything had to be smaller and taller. In other words, you were absolutely all the normal forces that would lead in New York to kind of making the building slimmer and taller were being sort of accelerated, propelled by this particular condition. So you're getting towers in the park, windy. Just in my mind, I would love the renderings with the thousands of people. You know, it's very easy to put them in with digital technology nowadays. But where are those? Who are those people? Where are they going? Why are they going to be walking there? So I think that we're in complete agreement that all of their particular reasons.
No, we're not in agreement because, in fact, there are tall buildings in Rockefeller Center, and lots of them. It isn't tall buildings that's that issue, it's the quality of the public realm and the absence of streets and sidewalks. And the reason they are absent is that the city planning department and the government of the city of New York set out a set of ground rules that precluded that. Their open spaces were determined by a master plan in advance. And they did not include streets, and they did not include sidewalks. And I am certain that architects who worked on it could very nicely have located the same high-rise buildings in a different configuration.
I totally agree, but I'm making the point that it's not just, but obviously, Rockefeller Center is a high-rise skyscraper complex. It's so it is that, but it is so much more. There's some of the other elements, and in that I don't think we're disagreeing about.
Bill, you worked on Hudson Yards, didn't you? Maybe you have some comments.
I worked on the most objection for Hudson Yards estate, but I didn't work on anything else. No, I didn't. The thing that I found interesting is a comparison between Lincoln Center and Rockefeller Center is the issue of the collaborative process. Because you have in the case of Lincoln Center, you have Phil Johnson, you have Max Abramovitz, you have Errol Saarinen, you have Pietro Belusky, all individuals of substantial abilities. But the buildings that they produced perhaps were, well, not worse than they've done, but close to it. And why was that the case? Because they had such a potential dynamic. Whereas in the case of Rockefeller Center, it was just the opposite. And so I think, for me, that aspect is the most important lesson. And I think right now journalism plays a huge role in the creation of the architect as a superstar. And it doesn't enable the architect to work in a collaborative fashion. It doesn't encourage the architect to work in a collaborative fashion. And so as a result, I think it has diminished our potential.
Well, I'll ask a question maybe of Dan and Hillary in terms of Rockefeller Center being, as you said, Bill, like sort of an architecture without authors, without specific authors. And we did argue for the genius of Raymond Hood as a sort of controlling mind and energy and dynamic but if you looked at Reinhardt and Hofmeister, they were belly of the building architects. They knew how to compact a core into a good office space layout. But yet, I mean, would it be possible to say that New York is the author of Rockefeller Center more than architects?
It's got a nice poetic ring to it. In fact, I think that the genius wasn't Raymond. I think it was John Arcott. That collaboration is a wonderful thing, but somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to say yes or no. And he had this extremely forceful personality. Now, he also had the judgment to believe that Hood was the talent he had with him. Corbett did nothing by all of the internal records. He was a wonderful theorist. He talked a lot, but he had no design for them. And Reinhardt and Hoffmeister were, as you say, they laid out office spaces. Wallace Harrison did have an important role in the later phase of the center, but the bringing it all together, I think it's that powerful, actually Moses-like figure, like Robert Moses, except with better taste.
And Hillary, with Penn Station, it really is the corporation that is setting the values of the program and ultimately deciding how the architects play in their game.
That's absolutely true. There was, in the case of Pennsylvania Station, though, a desire to make a significant rhetorical statement which transcended the function. And you've made the point in your work, Carol, over and over again about the rules of real estate and the role that they play in shaping buildings. And that certainly is a facet of Rockefeller Center, despite or notwithstanding the expansion of the public realm in Rockefeller Center. There's still the rules of real estate that shape that shape the towers. Lincoln Center did not participate in that, right? It wasn't just that it was a set of blocks that was wiped clean of buildings, but it was extricated from the rules of New York real estate. And I think that's, in the end, something that contributes to a certain sterility that one can feel, because it does feel like a place that's removed from the vernacular urbanism, the vernacular life of the city. But the architects were genuinely collaborative, and when you read the minutes of their own records, you see the individual architects were given responsibility for each theater, the shaping of the spaces that knit them together, the setting of the design guidelines that created unity. These were all team decisions.
And Alex, can you find one extraordinary thing about Rockefeller Center to summarize?
Well, I think the real estate basis of it is central. Hillary is absolutely right. The site was taken outside of normal real estate, but so was Battery Park City. And the rail yards that are underneath the Riverside South also allow the assemblage of large site. So I don't think it's the size of the site or even its being outside of the normal rules of real estate in terms of what goes into it. I think what it is that Rockefeller Center was built within the framework of a public realm that was agreed upon. The streets and the sidewalks, and you made the point, Mr. Oakland, at the very beginning about that. It's ordinary. The same thing is true of Grand Central Terminal. And it, of course, spans 3 blocks, but it has a highway running through it. It has underground subways. It also follows the vernacular of the city. And what these other projects did not do, with the exception of the 2 residential ones that I showed, Battery Park City and Riverside South, they rejected New York. If you go back and you look at Alex Hooper's writings about Battery Park City, he's trying to get the best of New York. It's called South End Avenue after West End Avenue. The railing is inspired by railings elsewhere in New York. Now that may be a little hokey, but the results are fabulous if you look at it. So I think that the question of is New York the author of Rockefeller Center is a very profound question. And in fact, the good things about these other projects, and the bad things about some of the later ones have very much to do with whether they are part of the vernacular of the city